And joining us from New Orleans, where a democracy summit is taking place, Stephen Horsford. He is a Democratic member of Congress from Nevada's 4th Congressional District, also the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congressman, thank you for being with us on a consequential day here in Washington.
Very consequential. Thank you for having me on your program. Let's
go through 2 of the 3 cases, and of course I want to begin with yesterday's ruling on affirmative action. First of all, your reaction. It was not unexpected, was it?
It was disappointing as the dissenting opinions from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, Sonia Sotomayor, and Justice Kagan indicated. I was hoping that their dissenting opinion would very much be the majority opinion. But sadly, the majority uprooted and rolled back 45 years of precedent, and it is going to make it more difficult for students of color, particularly Black and Latino and Asian Americans, to have access, particularly to some of the Ivy League institutions, and that is something that the Congressional Black Caucus is very concerned about, and will be working with the administration in the weeks to come on a legislative and legal strategy.
So how should and how will universities, especially in this case UNC, Harvard, other elite colleges and universities, how should they build a more diverse student body if race is not a factor in the admissions process, in the consideration process?
Well, I commend the initial information that we've gotten from the administration. There was a meeting today, in fact, where the Department of Education and the Department of Justice began to lay out what the universities and colleges will need to do based on this decision. Let me just say on the outset, this is going to cause a lot of disruption. And that is why it's important that the White House lead, because the Supreme Court, in its ideologically driven approach to dismantle race-conscious policy, is causing a lot of uncertainty. So from what the White House shared with us today, they will be convening a National Summit on Equality and Equal Opportunity in Higher Education. They'll convene the meeting with administrators from various colleges and universities to discuss these admissions plans going forward, as well as working with us on a set of recommendations for actions by the end of September.
Congressman, as you know, in statements issued yesterday, the former President Barack Obama and the former First Lady Michelle Obama saying affirmative action helped them, gave them a leg up when they wanted to go to colleges and universities, and they're worried about what it means for the next generation, not only in trying to get into these elite schools, but also what it means generationally as they move into the workplace. Your reaction to that?
Well, I agree with President Obama and former President Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama. Let me just also underscore, though, the essence of what they're saying. With all due respect to the person who opened up your program, this country's history has never been colorblind. If that were the case, we would not have enslaved people, we would not have Jim Crow laws, we would not have had segregation. Those were all institutions or policies that affected institutions, including education, K through 12 and higher education. So I really want us to focus on why is there inequality in America to begin with. It's because of the history of this nation and its impact particularly on the Black community around slavery, Jim Crow, and other racist practices. Because of that, we have these inequities. And to somehow suggest now that based on a decision from the Supreme Court that race no longer exists in America is simply wrong. We have 11 million job openings in America, 10 million people who are unemployed or underemployed. Higher education and colleges are a place where diversity is a strength, where differing backgrounds and lived experiences will help us compete as a nation globally And this Supreme Court ignored that fact and ruled, in my view, in a manner that is against the goals and the ideals of our nation.
On Twitter, you can find him at Rep. Horsford, Horsford. And Congressman, I want to ask you specifically about one of those justices in the majority opinion yesterday, Clarence Thomas. Do you think affirmative action helped him early in his career?
Well, it's not about what I think, it's what he said. But for affirmative action, he would not have been able to attend both the school, the undergraduate school and the law school that allowed him to have the opportunities that he later had to work in law firms that have positioned him for the position that he has. So that's based on his own, experience and what he's shared publicly. And for him to then not use his position to protect that right for other people, I think is appalling. And let me also be clear. Affirmative action does still exist. It exists for the privileged. It exists for those who benefit from legacy programs. It exists for those who attend Ivy League schools whose parents went there. It exists for those who can make hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of dollars of contributions to endowments to get their kids in. Affirmative action exists, and it has existed. What the race-based conscious affirmative action was doing was seeking to level the playing field based on the historic inequities that have existed and continue to exist to this day.
Well, I'd love to get your reaction to what Joy Reid said last night to this very point of the Associate Justice Clarence Thomas, put in place back in 1991, appointed by President George H.W. Bush, a contentious confirmation hearing that we all well remember. This is last night.
He seems to deeply resent all of the assistance he got, and he wants to make sure that nobody like him ever gets that kind of help again, because it helps his self-image so that he can lie to himself and fool himself and maybe hate himself a little less for having gotten help all along his path to the Supreme Court. And let's be clear, the most important thing to know about his confirmation, other than the fact that he's accused credibly of sexual misconduct, is the polling that got him over the line. And it was the polling that I very much remember. I was one of the few black folk who was against him. It was the polling that showed that about 7 in 10 black people supported his ascension to the seat once held by the great Thurgood Marshall, and he is not his equal.
That from Joy Reid last night on MSNBC. Congressman, your thoughts?
Well, I think she said enough about why Justice Thomas, unfortunately, is a disappointment to a lot of people. I've had my opinions about him over the years, but to hear his majority opinion and to read it and to hear the dissenting opinion from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, you see the comparison. And look, we have diversity of experiences and thought as well. I'm not going to challenge that part of his experience, but what I do know is that color blindness is not something that we can accept. Why is it that race is still used in the determination of a factor in whether someone committed a crime or not? So it could be used against a young black man in a situation where officers can pull them over and profile them, but it cannot now be used for the admission into college for them to better themselves. That is the hypocrisy. And on top of that, the Supreme Court just struck down the student loan relief package, which disproportionately affects particularly black women who are shouldering a greater share of debt, trying to improve their lives in order to compete in America.
Well, let me get to that point in just a moment. Tell us quickly what you're doing in New Orleans and what this conference is all about.
The Congressional Black Caucus members, through our institute, are actually doing a national summer of action called Democracy for the People. We are speaking directly to constituents because we understood before these decisions came down this week that our democracy is under attack and it's fragile. Whether it's on the courts, our schools, or on voting, we have to do things to mobilize, to organize, and to be strategic about our response. That includes legislative action in Congress and in the state legislatures and in school boards, but also to mobilize the people to understand their power in this moment through education, through voter registration, and through direct organizing. So we are here with Congressman Troy Carter, who is the host member. We've started in South Carolina a few weeks ago. We've been to Ohio and to Chicago. We'll be in Las Vegas in my district next week, and we'll continue to travel the country to reach our constituents directly, to speak to the people around the need for them to have the power in this moment to protect and to defend our democracy.
And Congressman, with regard to that Supreme Court ruling, another 6-3 decision that basically ends the White House student loan forgiveness plan, the Chief Justice writing that the law allows for the ability to waive or modify, but not to rewrite the statute from the ground up. I want to share with you what then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi had to say, because her remarks were used in the decision that was outlined earlier today by the Supreme Court.
People think that the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress. And I don't even like to call it forgiveness, because that implies a transgression. It's not to be forgiven. Just freeing people from those obligations. So the question of who gets forgiven, to use the term of art that is out there, is a debate. Do we use whatever money there is for the broadest base of support of those with more people with even less debt, or fewer people with more debt? That's a policy discussion. But the difference between the president can't do it. So that's not even a discussion. Not everybody realizes that, but the president can only postpone, delay, but not forgive.
So that was the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and in Milwaukee last year, President Biden had this to say.
I'm prepared to write off the $10,000 debt, but not 50.
Mr. President, let me ask you,
because I don't think I have the authority to do it by sign of a pen.
So, Congressman, as you hear that from the President, from the then Speaker of the House, your thoughts about the ruling today by the Supreme Court using that as part of their 6-3 argument?
It's a stretch. Look, number one, the President, through the Department of Education and at the behest of Congress when we passed the HEROES Act back in 2003, does have the authority, as you indicated, to modify and or eliminate a portion of student loan debt. The debate during the campaign was something about a higher amount of student loan debt. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, the president proposed, and the Congressional Black Caucus applauded, $10,000 for individuals and up to $20,000 for those that have a Pell Grant based on income and needs-based. Because of the impact of the pandemic, we have 40 million households who are affected by the downturn and the effects that occurred as a result of the pandemic, who are now going to be affected by this decision. I want to talk about how this affects real people in my district. You know, we talk a lot about Washington process and Supreme Court protocols. What about the very people who need its government, whether it be Congress, the president, or the courts, to do its job? So, yeah, I want Congress to do its job, and Democrats have worked tirelessly to pass legislation. That's why we need to eliminate the filibuster and get rid of the blue slip in the Senate, so that we don't have these Jim Crow traditions and rules that prevent us from governing when we have a majority. We've been unable to pass student loan relief. gun safety legislation, police accountability. There are voting rights reauthorization, the first time in 40 years. So these are things that Congress absolutely should do. The president used the authority that he believed he had, and the courts struck that down today. And now we will go back to figuring out Plan B.
Thank you, Congressman. CBS News is next. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.